How can God love me?
What is my purpose?
What happens after death?
Why do bad things keep happening to me?
Who is God?
Welcome to this segment of askGHCC, where we're going to answer the question, why does God allow innocent children to get cancer? And this is going to be part two to my answer of that question. In part one, we looked at it more from a philosophical and apologetic and theoretical approach. And in this segment, what I want to do is answer it from a more theological and pastoral perspective. That way we can, help people to be comforted and also to understand kind of theologically just where God fits in with suffering and pain and that kind of thing. And one of the first things is to make sure that we understand that one of the reasons why people ask this question in the first place is because of the pain that they're feeling. They want to know, where is God in the midst of my suffering? Where is God in the midst of my pain? And oftentimes they're asking the question, is there a purpose behind it? Or is my suffering just in vain? And so what I want to do today is talk about three major things in theology that I think really helps us, and that's the incarnation, the cross of Christ, and the resurrection of Christ. And by looking at those three things, we see that there's a lot that God has to say about suffering and things like cancer and children getting cancer. So I want to start first with what Paul says about grieving, because really what motivates asking this question is a sense of grief. And so what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians is that when we have loved ones and people we know who die, we shouldn't grieve as people who have no hope. And to say that positively, what he's saying is we should be people who grieve, but the kind of grieving that we do grieve should be filled with hope. And that's true because Christians have a great hope that goes beyond this life. And so my question is, what is that hope? And that's where the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection come in. Is it really does help us to understand what is the Christian hope and what does it mean to have hope in the midst of suffering and pain. And so we start with the incarnation, and that is the simple truth that God became a man and dwelt among us. And we're actually told in Colossians 1 that the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in the person of Christ. And when you see Jesus live his life, you see some pretty incredible things. One of the first things that I notice in the Gospels is how much Jesus empathizes with people. Oftentimes it says that he's moved with pity when he sees someone with leprosy, when he sees the woman who has a bleeding issue for a number of years, when he sees paralytic people, he heals them, and part of that is because he's moved with pity for them. But also Jesus had a good friend named Lazarus who dies, and you see Jesus weeping at the death of Lazarus. And even more than that, we see just throughout Jesus' life that he's a man of sorrows. And so as we contemplate the idea of God's incarnation, that God became a man and dwelt among us in the person of Christ, we see that God is not indifferent to suffering. He experienced the whole, suffering that humanity experiences. He experienced all of that. And so he empathizes with us, and we have just a great source to go to be comforted because we know that God cares. And just not only in Jesus' own life, but even when we think about the cross, we think about just how agonizing that must have been physically for Jesus. But also there's an emotional and spiritual dimension as well. When you contemplate the cross of Christ, you come to realize that Jesus was abandoned by his Father on the cross. And abandonment is a terrible emotional source of suffering. And so Jesus in his life really empathized with people, but he himself also was agonizing and experienced great suffering. And you see that even in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prays that if it's God's will to take this cup from him. So he is a man of sorrows. He's a man of great pain and suffering. And even on the cross of Christ, as much as the physical suffering was just overwhelming to him, also the emotional side of it was. When we put these two things together, what's really amazing about it is we ask ourselves the question, why does God allow innocent children to get cancer? And just by looking at the incarnation and the cross, you see that God empathizes with pain and empathizes with suffering, but there isn't an answer to the question. We're not given an answer to why God allows this stuff, but we are given what the answer isn't. And what I mean by that is when you look at the cross and the incarnation, we do know for a fact that the answer is not that God doesn't love us. In fact, the cross is a demonstration of God's incredible love for us. And so when we experience pain and suffering of all kinds, we have to realize that the incarnation and the cross of Christ are evidences of God's love, that God is on this grand rescue plan to redeem creation and to redeem us as well. And so part of our experience with suffering and pain is to come to the realization that God really does love us, and God really is empathizing with us, and God is a great source of consolation and comfort. But Christianity is not merely a consolation faith. What I mean by that is, in this life we experience suffering and hardship, and heaven is offered to us, but it's not as a consolation, as if this life was terrible, and so the consolation prize is, here's heaven. It's not like that. Christianity is a resurrection faith. And what we mean by that is, Christianity is all about renewal. It's about restoration, about reconciliation. That grand rescue plan that Jesus came on in the incarnation and through his cross was to reconcile all things to himself. That's what Colossians 1 teaches us, is that the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in the person of Christ. And through Christ, he's reconciling all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And he's making peace by the blood of his cross. And that one simple verse is just a reminder for us about God's big redemption and rescue plan, that he is in fact reconciling all things to himself, and he's doing it through the person and work of Jesus Christ. And when you begin to think about the implications of that, you come to realize that all things, things in heaven and things on earth, are being reconciled in and through Christ, which means that even creation itself, the hills and mountains and waters and sky and planets and stars, all these things are going to be restored and renewed. And a part of creation includes ourselves. And what we mean by that is, if God is restoring and renewing all things, and all things are the created things, and since our bodies are created, then we come to understand that even our bodies are going to be restored and renewed, and we're going to be reconciled in our bodies. And that's why 1 Corinthians 15 is an important chapter for us. It's all about the resurrected body. You see, a lot of people have a misnomer about what Christianity teaches. They think that heaven is some sort of thing where we float around as immaterial, disembodied beings, but that's not what heaven is at all. In fact, heaven, as we look through the scriptures, heaven actually comes to earth. And as heaven comes to earth, there's restoration, there's renewal, and there's perfection. And we actually are recipients of a resurrected body, a physical resurrected body, which is free of cancer, which is free of decay, which is free of any of the effects from the fall, any of those curses. And so as we look at these kinds of things and we begin to think about what do we do with this question of why does God allow innocent children to get cancer? The reason why we ask this question is a lot of times because of the grief that we have, the anguish that is inside of us. But we ought not to grieve as those who have no hope. And so what is the Christian hope? The Christian hope succinctly is simply this, that God is not idle. God is doing something about the evil in this world, and he has done something. And what is it that he's done? He's become a man for us and experienced all the suffering and all the pain and all the sorrows that come with human life because he himself, God Almighty, became a man. And he also went to the cross, experiencing not only the agony of physical pain and suffering, but the agony of emotional pain and suffering as he was abandoned by his Father on the cross. And so God is a great comforter. God is a great source of strength and hope because he walked in our shoes and he knows what we feel. But more than that, Jesus Christ rose from the dead on the third day. And that resurrection is a guarantee that all of his promises are coming true. That his promise in Matthew 19, that he will sit on his glorious throne at the renewal of all things. That this Christ now sits at the right hand of the Father and he is restoring and renewing all things to himself. That resurrection is our hope. That we will one day shed this earth suit and get a glorified, imperishable body which will be free of cancer. That's the hope that we have as Christians. It won't be a disembodied existence. It'll be a true bodily, physical existence in a new created, restored, renewed place, this new heaven and new earth. And the interesting thing about this whole theological thing is the whole predicament we're in with pain and suffering, cancer itself, is a product of the fall, what happened in the garden with Adam and Eve and Satan. What's interesting is in Revelation 21, you kind of see this reversal happening. Everything that flowed from the garden and from the fall, those curses, because of the finished work of Christ, that curse is reversed and it's working backward. And so in the end, what we're going to get is a garden-like experience with God, but it's going to be a perfected garden experience. Satan won't be there. There will be no temptation. There will be no sin. There will be no suffering. It's a place for us to dwell with God forever. And as Christians, that's our hope, that the curse has been reversed because of the person and work of Jesus Christ. So when we experience people who are suffering and who are going through great pain, one of the greatest things we can do, if they're not Christians, they don't know this hope, is to offer them this hope, that there's life beyond the grave, that they know intuitively that we have somehow been preloaded with a conception of a just world, a better world than this world. We know that there is something out there called heaven. And so we can offer this hope to people, that there is a resurrected body. There is a place that is free of pain and suffering. And for those people who are Christians who do know this hope and they are in the midst of their suffering, we have to remind them that God came incarnate. He knows what we're going through, that he went to a cross and he took on suffering. And so our God is a suffering, weeping God, and he can empathize with us and he knows how to help us. And lastly, our God resurrected, and he has conquered sin and death and evil itself. And he has promised us that when he returns, there will be a kingdom that will come with him, this new heaven and new earth that will be free of all of this pain, and we will get our new bodies and we will reign with him forever and ever in a restored and perfected garden, this new Eden place called heaven. And so as I look at this question of why does God allow innocent children to get cancer, we can answer it from an apologetic, philosophical, theoretical way like I did in part one, but we can also answer it in a theological, pastoral way like in this one, part two. We do have hope as Christians, and so we ought not to grieve as though we have no hope. There's a great hope